This is the Cattle Boom Big Show, the second in our Settling the West unit. So, in our last big show, we talked about what a boom was, a time of extreme economic growth. And in this particular case, it was extreme economic growth caused by the raising and selling of cattle for food. Really cattle ranching in the West. And there's a few reasons why this was possible, and then we're going to look at the effect it had on the development of the West. Just like mining helped stimulate settling and development of the West, and also would put stress on the native peoples who lived there, and as it turned out, the dominant wild creature of the area, the American bison, the buffalo, this would have a similar impact. So the cattle boom refers to the open range cattle industry that went from Texas into Montana, and we're talking about from 1870s to 1880s. And really, when you see movies and TV shows about the West and cowboys of the West, we're really talking about this 20-year period of time. So this is this vast area of what today is Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas and Wyoming and into Montana. This was a vast territory with virtually nothing there as far as cities, no roads, and this was the open range that allowed this cattle industry to take off. But in order for it to take off, we needed this particular critter right here, the Texas Longhorn. He was an animal that was particularly well suited for the rugged environment of the Great Plains. He's also immune to Texas fever, which was a disease carried by ticks. That disease would kill domestic cows from the east, but not the Texas Longhorn. Unfortunately for the buffalo, they could not coexist with the cows because the cows were going to eat the same resources that the buffalo did. And so it really helped speed up the destruction of the buffalo. What you're looking at here is a collection of nothing more than buffalo skulls. The Army and the U.S. government paid buffalo hunters, and the Army itself engaged in a lot of buffalo hunting, not for food, but just to slaughter the animal, so they would get out of the way and open the range for domestic cattle, or the Texas Longhorn. There were two main herds of American bison, a northern herd and a southern herd. They would migrate north and south with the seasons. Between the two herds, there might have been as many as 5 to 6 million buffalo in that area, and they were not going to be able to coexist with the scarce resources of that area, and so they were wiped out. By the 1880s, the huge buffalo herds that I just described were down to just a few hundred, which had sheltered in an isolated valleys of Yellowstone National Park, pictured there. And if you've been to Yellowstone, you know it's a very rugged area, and this is not something where cows would have gone anyway. What caused this desire for this cattle, all of this cattle for this food? Well, it was the rapid growth of population in eastern cities, and it led to an increased demand for beef. Before 1870s, people did eat beef, but not nearly to the degree they ate after the 1870s. A demand was created, and it became really popular and typical to consume larger quantities of beef. So there was a lot of money to be made in raising cattle. Another thing that helped was the growth and spread of the railroads, was another reason for this cattle boom to happen. You have to get the cows from the Great Plains to the cities like Philadelphia and even Chicago, but Cleveland and New York and Boston, and the cows aren't going to walk there. So the growth of railroads allowed the beef to be shipped to big cities, and this map shows the railroads during this time period, and Not many in the Great Plains, but lots in the east, and they would be shipped, they would be brought to areas and sent to the east. Towns located along a railroad were called railheads, and they became prosperous areas and where people wanted to live. Long cattle drives ended at these railheads. So a cattle drive is when you would round up your cows who would just be walking free in the prairie. You would pay nothing to feed them. They would just eat what was ever out there, and they would be herded up on these cattle drives to the railheads, and they would load it on train cars and sent to the east for processing. These railheads became known as cattle towns, and we're talking about places like Dodge City, Kansas. This is a picture of Dodge City in about 1880. Wichita, Kansas, again a picture from the time period. Abilene, Kansas, and Cheyenne, Wyoming. Now, if you're wondering why there are so many in like Kansas and then again in Wyoming, you have to think about where those are in relation to in the Great Plains and places where the railroads would go to, and the cows would be rounded up and driven to these places and then sent east. They also were, this was a lot of happened because of this guy, Gustavus Swift, and his invention. He developed a refrigerated rail car. He figured out a way to transport the butchered cattle that was butchered in Chicago, so they'd be loaded on train cars in Dodge City, Kansas, or Wichita, Kansas, and sent by train to Chicago. You don't want to they don't want to be too many days on the train car because they wouldn't survive the trip. You'd get them to Chicago, they'd be slaughtered and butchered and put in this refrigerated rail car and then sent east, further east, to places like Cleveland and Philadelphia and New York and Washington and Boston to be consumed by people. This is a picture of Swift's refrigerated railway car, and this is by the end of the 1800s. This was a typical thing. So cattle drives were moving the cattle from the prairie where they lived and could be fed for free to the railheads, requiring a long cattle drive. The drives might cover hundreds of miles and take months, but it was well worth it. You could make a lot of money bringing the cows because you've raised them for nothing. You didn't spend any money to feed them. You didn't have to look after them at all. You just round them up and you take them to railheads. Here's another picture of the cattle drives typically would take place, and you can see the different trails, and they would end up in places like Cheyenne and Abilene and Sedalia, Missouri, and then shipped east from there. Here's a picture of a typical cattle drive from that time period, and the cowboy in the distance. And remember where we talked about cowboys that we see in TV and movies, that this is from just this time period. This is when the cattle drives, and really it would be over by 1890, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. Another picture of a cattle drive. So what caused the end of the cattle boom? Ranchers were eager for large profits, and people get greedy and they think, well, if I can raise 1,000 head of cattle and make money, then maybe I can make twice as much with 2,000 or 10,000, make 10 times as much. And everyone thought that. And so pretty soon they crowded the open range with too many cattle. And you'd say, well, such a huge area, how could you have too many? Well, there is a finite amount of resources of food and water for cattle. And it put stress on the environment. And then in 1885, the price for beef crashed. And when you take economics, you'll learn about supply and demand. When the demand was not as near as big as the supply, so way too many cows and not enough people wanting it, the price dropped. And it went from $35 for a cow in 1882 to $8 in 1885. So then you were losing money on your cows, every cow that you had. The next thing that really impacted the open range was barbed wire. Seems like a little thing, but when ranchers began fencing off and farmers began fencing off their fields, it's inconvenient to grow wheat in Kansas and have thousands of cows walk through it, destroys your crop. You start wrapping barbed wire, fencing off your area, you cut off the open range. and it also would control access to the water. You want to control your water. You don't want cows drinking it all up. You want to be able to use it for your domestic livestock on your farm and for your crops, for irrigation. So barbed wire. And finally, severe weather. There was massive blizzards in 1885, 1886, and this was followed by severe droughts. So between the two, the droughts and then the following blizzards that would happen, ranchers decided it was very inconvenient to use open range, better to have a food supply that you can count on, and raising hay to feed their cattle and using the barbed wire to fence off your area, and then transport your cows in a different way. And the railheads, by this time, by the late 1800s, they would start spreading deeper and deeper into the Great Plains, and you didn't have to travel nearly as far to take your cattle to market. They would still be loaded on train cars and still trucked, still through train, taken to Chicago, where they'd be butchered and processed and sent to the east. But the impact of all of this was that it brought people to the Great Plains. It helped wipe out the American bison, and this would be important for the nomadic Native Americans who lived on the American bison. And it also helped settle this area with more and more train cars to the Great Plains, more and more telegraph wires stretched throughout there, more and more cities and towns and schools and churches, and development of this area. These areas became states and settled because of cows.